erased it, buried it, hid it from generations. But now, the forgotten prophecy of Jeremiah is resurfacing, and what it reveals could change everything we thought we knew about the Bible and the end of days. You've heard of Jeremiah, the prophet of tears, the man who warned of Jerusalem's destruction while the world ignored him. But what if I told you that not all his warnings made it into the Bible you read today? Ancient texts, banned scrolls, and missing fragments suggest there were more prophecies, darker, more disturbing, censored by religious leaders centuries ago. And these lost messages might contain terrifying clues connected to the book of Revelation and the times we're living in right now. Stay with me, because once you hear this, you'll never look at prophecy or the future the same way again. What if I told you that one of the most powerful, disturbing, and dangerous messages in the entire Bible might be missing? Not misplaced, not forgotten by accident, but intentionally hidden, buried beneath centuries of tradition, fear, and control. And it all starts with one man, Jeremiah. Jeremiah wasn't your typical prophet. He wasn't welcomed. He wasn't celebrated. He was hunted, ridiculed, imprisoned, and nearly killed. The people of his time didn't want to hear the truth, and the truth he carried was heavy, brutal, and impossible to ignore. While most prophets delivered hope mixed with warnings, Jeremiah's words were pure fire, raw, unapologetic, filled with grief and divine anger. He lived through the darkest days of Jerusalem, watching the walls crumble, the temple burn, families destroyed, and his nation shattered under the weight of its own disobedience. But here's the part they don't tell you in Sunday school. What if Jeremiah said more? What if the most unsettling parts of his message never made it into the Bible you have today? For centuries, scholars, theologians, and even ancient communities have whispered about writings, lost prophecies, hidden scrolls, fragments that carry Jeremiah's voice beyond what we've been allowed to see. And the reason? Simple. Some truths are too dangerous. You see, during Jeremiah's life, the nation of Judah was in full-blown collapse. Babylon's armies were at the gates, and the religious leaders, kings, and priests were desperate to keep control. They didn't want panic. They didn't want rebellion. And above all, they didn't want anyone questioning their authority. But Jeremiah, he stood right in the middle of that firestorm, calling out the corruption, exposing the lies, and warning that divine judgment was coming, whether they liked it or not. His words were sharp, direct, and impossible to sugarcoat. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't trying to keep his reputation clean. He was the mouthpiece of God during a time when no one wanted to hear from God. And history shows that when a prophet like that speaks, and the message threatens the system, people will do anything to silence him. But here's the twist. Even with all the persecution, imprisonment, and exile, Jeremiah's message survived. At least part of it. The scrolls that made it into the Old Testament tell a brutal, honest story. But fragments from ancient archives, writings attributed to his scribe, Baruch, and hidden texts found among early Christian and Jewish communities suggest there's more. A lot more. And what's inside those lost prophecies? That's where things get unsettling. Imagine a message so direct, so politically dangerous, so spiritually alarming, that powerful leaders decided the only way to protect their position was to erase it. Not because it wasn't true, but because it exposed too much. It revealed the corruption at the highest levels. It warned of coming destruction that couldn't be stopped. And it carried details about the end times that aligned too closely with what we're seeing unfold in our world today. Think about that for a second. You've got ancient religious authorities, kings, and rulers terrified of one man's words. Not because they're false, but because they're impossible to ignore. They couldn't silence Jeremiah himself, so they did the next best thing. They controlled the narrative. They decided which prophecies stayed and which ones were locked away, hidden in caves, destroyed, or simply erased from the records. And centuries later, fragments began to resurface, bits and pieces that scholars have analyzed, texts attributed to Baruch, the loyal scribe who followed Jeremiah through the chaos. These aren't random myths or conspiracy theories. We're talking about documented writings, preserved by communities that believed the full message of Jeremiah was too important to lose, even if it meant risking everything to preserve it. The lost prophecies hint at more than just historical warnings. They speak of spiritual decay, political manipulation, the fall of great empires, and the consequences of a society that turns its back on truth. But here's the chilling part. Those descriptions don't just fit ancient Judah. They fit us, right now, in ways that are hard to ignore. Wars breaking out, moral foundations collapsing, leaders driven by greed, the rise of deception on a global scale. It all sounds familiar, doesn't it? Could it be that the prophecies erased from Jeremiah's writings hold keys to understanding the chaos we're living through? Could those hidden words reveal connections between the fall of Jerusalem and the signs leading to the end times? That's the question we're diving into. And the more you peel back the layers, the more obvious it becomes. This isn't just ancient history. This is a warning. A warning that was censored, buried, and nearly forgotten until now. Because once you understand what was lost, you start to see the patterns. The pieces fit together. And suddenly, the hidden prophecies of Jeremiah aren't just relics from the past. They're a map. A brutal, honest, unfiltered map, pointing straight to the days we're living in. And if that unsettles you, good. It should. Because when leaders decide what parts of prophecy the people are allowed to hear, it means they're hiding something. Something that could shake the foundations of faith, challenge the system, and wake people up to the reality of what's coming. Stay with me, because what comes next will change the way you see the Bible, history, and the future forever. Now here's where things get even more uncomfortable. You see, everything we've talked about so far, the warnings Jeremiah gave, the destruction he predicted, the backlash he faced, that's all in the Bible most people know. But what if I told you that wasn't the whole story? That there's a second layer buried beneath the surface, and it's tied to a name you probably haven't heard much about. Baruch. Baruch wasn't just a bystander in Jeremiah's life. He wasn't some random scribe taking notes in the background. Baruch was the one person who stood by Jeremiah through the chaos, through the persecution, through the collapse of Jerusalem. When Jeremiah was imprisoned, beaten, silenced, Baruch kept writing. When the city burned and the people scattered, Baruch carried the words that everyone else wanted to erase. And here's where it gets real interesting. Centuries after these events, texts began to surface with Baruch's name attached to them. Ancient manuscripts, scrolls preserved by small groups, writings found outside the official canon, all pointing to the possibility that Jeremiah's most dangerous, most politically explosive messages didn't disappear. They were hidden, preserved, locked away by those who refused to let them die. These writings are known as the Book of Baruch. They don't appear in every Bible. They aren't taught in most churches, but they exist. And the warnings inside them are brutal, raw, and terrifyingly relevant. We're talking about prophecies that go beyond the destruction of Jerusalem, prophecies about the fall of entire kingdoms, the deception of world leaders, and a coming judgment that stretches far beyond the ancient world. Some historians argue these texts were excluded from the Bible for a reason, not because they were false, but because they revealed too much. They connected the dots between spiritual corruption and political power. They exposed how leaders manipulate faith to control people. And most dangerously, they suggested that the patterns of rebellion, collapse, and divine judgment weren't limited to one nation or one time period. They repeat over and over across history. And that brings us to the question most people don't want to ask. Why were these prophecies hidden? Who decided what stayed in the Bible and what got erased? And what was so dangerous about Jeremiah's full message that it couldn't be shared openly? The reality is, religion and politics have always been connected, more than people care to admit. In Jeremiah's day, kings and priests worked together to control the narrative. They didn't want panic. They didn't want rebellion. They wanted obedience, even if it meant silencing God's messenger. But when the destruction came, when Jerusalem fell, when the temple burned, every word Jeremiah spoke was proven true. Now fast forward to what we know today. Baruch's writings didn't vanish completely. They survived, passed down by underground communities, preserved in ancient languages, studied by scholars willing to look beyond the official version. And in those writings, we find details that are impossible to ignore. Baruch speaks of nations rising in arrogance, believing they're untouchable, only to collapse from within. He describes societies drowning in greed, violence, and moral decay, only to face consequences they never saw coming. He warns of leaders who deceive, who claim to serve the people but secretly serve themselves, dragging entire generations into destruction. Sound familiar? Look around at the world today. Global tensions, collapsing economies, wars breaking out, corruption exposed at the highest levels. And tell me these ancient warnings don't apply right now. This isn't just history repeating itself. It's a pattern, a blueprint for how civilizations fall when they ignore truth and chase power. But here's where it hits even harder. Some researchers believe that hidden within Baruch's writings, and the fragments attributed to Jeremiah, are warnings that tie directly to the end times. Not vague predictions, but specific signs. Political instability, global deception, moral collapse, and a final judgment that catches the world off guard. The deeper you go into these texts, the more undeniable it becomes. Someone wanted this information buried. Someone decided the people didn't need to know the full truth. And maybe they were afraid of what would happen if the warnings got out. Afraid that people would wake up, challenge the system, refuse to be controlled. Think about the implications. If these hidden prophecies connect the fall of ancient Jerusalem to what we're experiencing today, then we're not just talking about forgotten history. We're talking about real-time consequences for ignoring divine warnings. We're talking about patterns repeating on a global scale, and most people are still asleep to it. It raises questions nobody wants to face. How much of what we've been taught was filtered, censored, strategically edited to keep people passive? What messages did Jeremiah deliver that were too dangerous for public consumption? And why are those same messages resurfacing now, in a time when the world feels like it's standing on the edge of collapse again? Baruch's texts don't sugarcoat reality. They don't offer comfortable sermons or feel-good promises. They expose the hard truth. When leaders corrupt faith, when societies reject accountability, when people trade truth for convenience, destruction follows. Every time. And it starts slow. A lie here, a compromise there, until suddenly, everything crumbles, and people stand in shock wondering how it all happened. But it didn't happen overnight, and the hidden prophecies warned it would play out exactly like this. Which means, if we keep ignoring those warnings, the consequences are coming, faster than we think. Stay locked in, because what I'm about to reveal next digs even deeper into the reasons behind the suppression of these prophecies, and how their message connects to one of the most terrifying books of the Bible, Revelation. This isn't over, it's only getting started. The year was 586 BC, the year everything fell apart. Jerusalem, once considered the holy city chosen by God himself, was reduced to ashes. The walls were broken, the temple destroyed, families scattered like dust in the wind. And standing in the middle of that collapse was Jeremiah, broken, hated, weeping, but proven right. Every warning he delivered, every prophecy people ignored, played out with brutal precision. But here's the part of the story they never taught most of us. The destruction of Jerusalem wasn't just a historical event. It was a message, a final physical consequence of years, decades, of spiritual decay, leadership failure, and public denial. And Jeremiah's life during that chaos, it exposes the full cost of ignoring truth. For years before the Babylonian army marched in, Jeremiah had been the one voice shouting against the noise. While other so-called prophets told the people everything would be fine, while kings held on to their power, priests protected their status, Jeremiah spoke the hard reality. He warned that corruption had rotted the nation from the inside out. He called out leaders for manipulating faith to control people. He exposed the growing greed, violence, and arrogance spreading through the streets, but no one listened. Instead, they attacked him. They called him a traitor. They accused him of destroying morale, weakening the nation's spirit. They locked him up, beat him, tried to silence him, because the truth is dangerous, especially when it threatens power. And as the Babylonians closed in, the leaders still refused to face reality. They believed their rituals, their political alliances, and their false sense of security would save them. But Jeremiah knew better, and history proved him right. The Babylonians crushed the city, leveled the temple, and humiliated the people, exactly as Jeremiah warned. Here's where things get chilling for us today. That collapse wasn't just about physical destruction. It was the final stage of a slow, rotting process that started years earlier, a process driven by arrogance, lies, and compromise. The people of Judah convinced themselves they could live however they wanted, as long as they kept up appearances. But underneath the rituals, the corruption was eating everything alive. And when the judgment came, it didn't arrive overnight. It crept in, quietly, methodically, through bad leadership, spiritual decay, and the refusal to hear inconvenient truths. Jeremiah lived through every second of it. And even after watching his nation collapse, he kept writing, kept warning, kept delivering a message no one wanted to hear. What's terrifying is how familiar that sounds right now. Look at the world today. Nations on the brink, economies shaking, leaders playing political games while people suffer. Faith turned into a marketplace of comfort instead of truth. The patterns are identical: arrogance, corruption, moral decay, and the silencing of anyone brave enough to speak against the system. It's happening again. And if we're honest, most people still don't want to hear it. They want easy answers, quick fixes, and leaders who tell them what they want to hear. But Jeremiah's story proves how dangerous that mindset is, because the warnings never disappear. They just get buried under convenience, entertainment, and denial. What makes this even more unsettling is knowing that Jeremiah wasn't just another voice in ancient history. His life, his suffering, and his words mirror what happens when a society reaches its breaking point. And let me tell you, that breaking point doesn't always come with loud alarms or obvious warnings. Sometimes it's quiet. It creeps in during moments of comfort, when people feel untouchable, when leaders get too powerful, when truth gets labeled as dangerous. And that's exactly where Jeremiah stood, in the middle of a nation blinded by pride, holding a message no one wanted, but everyone needed. And here's the thing, that message isn't buried in the past. It's echoing now, because the same conditions that led to Jerusalem's collapse are alive and well today. The destruction of Jerusalem wasn't just a military defeat, it was the consequence of spiritual rebellion. People thought they could outsmart God, manipulate truth, buy protection with political deals, and silence voices like Jeremiah. But reality hit hard, and when it did, the walls didn't just fall, the entire foundation of their society crumbled. And Jeremiah, he survived it all, broken, hated, grieving, but standing in the ruins, proven right. His warnings were fulfilled, but his message didn't die there. He kept writing. His words, preserved through his scribe Baruch and fragments scattered across ancient texts, carried a deeper warning, one the world still refuses to face. Because here's the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Collapse doesn't happen by accident. Nations, communities, even individuals, they fall the same way Jerusalem did. Slowly, through compromise, lies, arrogance, and the refusal to face inconvenient truths. And if you think that pattern ended with ancient Israel, think again. The symptoms are everywhere: division, deception, leadership corruption, spiritual decay. And just like before, there are voices warning about it. But they're silenced, ridiculed, ignored, because hearing the truth forces change. And most people aren't ready for that. Jeremiah's story isn't about ancient politics. It's about how dangerous denial can be. It's about what happens when people trade truth for comfort, when leaders manipulate faith, and when society convinces itself it's too strong to fall. But no one's too strong to fall. Not Jerusalem, not Babylon, not modern empires, and certainly not the world we live in today. The destruction Jeremiah witnessed was more than the fall of a city. It was the consequence of ignoring divine truth, of silencing messengers, of replacing accountability with arrogance. And if history has taught us anything, it's that those consequences always catch up. The question is, are we paying attention? Because the hidden prophecies, the lost writings, the parts of Jeremiah's message that were buried, they didn't vanish by accident. They were hidden for a reason. And uncovering them means facing truths most people have spent their whole lives avoiding. But that's exactly what we're doing here. We're digging beneath the surface, exposing what was buried, and connecting the dots the world doesn't want to see. And the more you uncover, the more obvious it becomes. This isn't ancient history repeating itself. It's a warning playing out in real time. And what comes next could make what happened to Jerusalem look like the beginning of something much bigger. Stay with me, because we're just scratching the surface. And once you hear the next part of this story, you'll understand exactly why they tried so hard to bury Jeremiah's full message, and how it ties directly to the global chaos we're seeing unfold right now. What if everything we've been taught about the Bible is only part of the picture? You see, for generations, we've read the same stories, heard the same verses, followed the same official narrative. But what they don't tell you is that hidden beneath the surface, buried under centuries of religious control, there are missing pieces. Pieces that could change everything we think we know about prophecy, history, and the future. This is where things get uncomfortable, because once you pull back that curtain, you can't unsee it. The Bible we hold today wasn't formed overnight. It wasn't dropped from the sky in its complete polished form. It was assembled, selected, shaped by people. People with agendas, fears, political alliances, and, let's be honest, the desire to control how the story was told. That's not a conspiracy theory. It's historical fact. Councils met. Debates raged. Books were included, others were excluded. And those decisions determined what millions of people would believe for generations. But here's the problem. When men are the gatekeepers of divine truth, what happens when they choose to bury the parts that threaten their power? That's exactly what many believe happened with Jeremiah. His prophecies were never convenient. They exposed corruption, warned of divine judgment, and shattered the illusion of untouchable leadership. And according to ancient writings, some of his most dangerous messages never made it into the version of Scripture most people read today. You start to see this when you look at the lost writings attributed to his scribe, Baruch. These texts paint a picture of a prophet relentlessly delivering God's warnings, not just about ancient Jerusalem, but about patterns of rebellion, collapse, and divine reckoning that ripple through history. And those lost prophecies, they point to something bigger than just one city falling. They suggest that behind the visible events of the world, there's a spiritual war playing out, a battle between truth and deception, between accountability and arrogance, between a society drifting further from God and the consequences that always follow. And if you think that's ancient history, look around. We live in a world where truth is constantly twisted, where powerful elites manipulate narratives, where spiritual decay is disguised as progress, and where anyone bold enough to speak uncomfortable truths is silenced, ridiculed, or ignored. That's exactly what Jeremiah faced. His message wasn't polished. It wasn't designed to comfort people in their rebellion. It was a hard, brutal mirror held up to society. And that's precisely why they wanted it censored. But some fragments slipped through the cracks. Hidden texts preserved by underground communities. Whispers of lost prophecies that suggest the warning wasn't just for Jeremiah's generation. It was for every generation walking the same dangerous path. The more you dig, the clearer the pattern becomes. Jeremiah wasn't just talking about temples and kings. His words, especially the hidden ones, describe what happens when a society lets pride, corruption, and deception rule. It starts small, a compromise here, a lie there, but it grows, festers, until collapse becomes unavoidable. And here's the hook that grabs your attention. Scholars who've studied these lost writings believe they hold clues that connect directly to the end times, to the chaos we see unfolding across the globe right now. Think about that. Hidden fragments, lost for centuries, buried by religious and political leaders afraid of what they revealed. And those same messages align with the warnings Jesus gave in the New Testament, with the visions in Revelation, with the very signs many believe are happening right in front of us. We're talking about prophecies that expose global deception, collapsing morality, leaders drunk on power, and societies standing on the edge of divine judgment. It's not coincidence. It's a pattern repeating, and the missing pieces of Jeremiah's message connect the dots. But here's where it gets more personal. Because this isn't just about nations and empires falling. It's about individuals, families, communities drifting so far from truth that by the time they realize the consequences are real, it's too late. That's why these lost prophecies matter. They're not just relics of ancient history. They're a warning, raw, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore, about where we're headed if the same mistakes play out again. And if history's taught us anything, it's that people love to repeat mistakes. They love comfort more than truth. They love control more than accountability. And when the warnings come, they silence them, bury them, pretend they don't exist, until everything collapses, just like Jerusalem. That's the trap we're walking into right now. The same spiritual rebellion, the same political games, the same manipulation of truth, and the lost prophecies of Jeremiah. They show us how this ends if we refuse to wake up. It's uncomfortable, it's confronting, but you can't look at the world, the wars, the corruption, the deception, and not see the parallels. You can't read the fragments of Baruch's writings, see the patterns Jeremiah warned about, and dismiss them as irrelevant. We're not watching isolated events. We're watching history's warning signs flash in real time, and the very parts of Jeremiah's message they tried to hide, they're the blueprint for understanding how this unfolds and how close we might be to repeating the final stage. The question is, will we keep ignoring it? Will we keep chasing comfort, distractions, and lies? Or will we face the hard truth buried for centuries, the truth they fought to silence, but couldn't erase completely? Stay with me, because we're going deeper into the evidence, the lost fragments, and how they connect directly to the most feared book in the Bible, Revelation. And once you see the full picture, you'll understand exactly why this message was hidden, and why it's time to resurface is now. The name Baruch doesn't get mentioned much in most churches, but the truth is, without him, the world may never have heard the words of Jeremiah. Baruch wasn't just a scribe scribbling down what the prophet said. He was the man standing in the shadows of history, preserving some of the most dangerous and suppressed words the ancient world had ever heard. And it's through Baruch that a whole new layer of Jeremiah's message begins to surface. A layer that religious institutions and political powers have been quietly keeping out of sight for centuries. Let me break this down, because once you understand who Baruch was, the picture gets a lot clearer and a lot more disturbing. Baruch was the son of Neriah from a respected family, educated, capable, and trusted by Jeremiah at a time when trust could get you killed. He wasn't a prophet himself, but make no mistake, he stood shoulder to shoulder with one of the most hated, hunted, and controversial figures in all of biblical history. Imagine this. The nation is collapsing, the temple desecrated, the leaders exposed as corrupt. And while most people run for cover or fall silent, Baruch is right there, writing down every word Jeremiah speaks. Not just the safe parts, not just the parts the rulers wanted to hear. Every single warning, every uncomfortable truth, every prophecy about destruction, corruption, and the inevitable consequences of turning from God. Now here's the twist that keeps most people up at night. Some of Baruch's writings survived, but they didn't make it into the Bible as we know it. These texts, known as the Book of Baruch, have been preserved in certain ancient manuscripts, especially within communities that didn't answer to Rome, didn't conform to political pressures, and weren't afraid to keep the full record intact, even when it cost them everything. And what's inside those writings? They don't sound like watered-down sermons or vague spiritual advice. They sound like war cries, like declarations against the moral and political decay of entire nations. Baruch's words hit like a hammer, warning that arrogance, greed, and false religion lead straight to collapse. And here's where it gets even more relevant. The specific patterns Baruch describes didn't end with ancient Israel. He speaks of nations rising in defiance against God, drowning in wealth and corruption, blinded by their own success, until judgment falls. He describes societies where leaders lie. Spiritual truth is replaced with empty rituals, and people chase pleasure while ignoring the storm gathering on the horizon. Sound familiar? It should, because that's not just ancient history, that's the nightly news. And yet, for centuries, most people never hear about this. The Book of Baruch is tucked away, dismissed as irrelevant, or labeled apocryphal. meaning outside the accepted biblical canon. But have you ever stopped to ask why? Who decided that? And what were they afraid would happen if these words reached the public? The deeper you dig into history, the more obvious the answer becomes. The early formation of religious authority, councils, emperors, church leaders, all played a role in deciding which books made it into the official Bible. Their goal? Maintain control, keep the narrative clean, eliminate threats to their version of order. Jeremiah's accepted writings were already enough to make people uncomfortable. His warnings about destruction, his exposure of corrupt leadership, his brutal honesty about God's judgment, that was already dangerous. But the fuller picture, the complete record of his message captured by Baruch, that could ignite rebellion, shake empires, and expose spiritual corruption on a global scale. And maybe that's exactly why it was hidden. Because the warnings inside the book of Baruch aren't just ancient poetry or forgotten history, they're blueprints, showing how nations fall, how leaders manipulate, and how societies collapse when they trade truth for comfort and morality for power. Let's be honest, we're living in that blueprint right now. Global tension, corrupt politics, people chasing empty promises while the foundations of society crack beneath their feet. The arrogance, the deception, the spiritual decay Baruch described are staring us in the face. But most people are too distracted to notice. And that distraction isn't an accident. Powerful systems depend on keeping the masses passive, feeding them entertainment, false hope, and easy lies, while burying the parts of history and scripture that challenge their control. The lost prophecies of Jeremiah, preserved by Baruch, are the ultimate threat to that system, because they expose the truth in raw, unfiltered terms. The truth is, those prophecies cut through political games, religious corruption, and social deception like a sword. They call people back to accountability, to humility, to the reality that God isn't mocked, and that ignoring his warnings doesn't delay the consequences. It guarantees them. And here's the most uncomfortable part. The same spiritual pride, corruption, and rebellion that destroyed ancient Jerusalem are being repeated across the world today. You don't have to be a theologian to see it. Nations drunk on power, leaders obsessed with image, truth silenced, replaced with convenience. And beneath it all, a quiet but growing storm of judgment building, just like Baruch described. That's why this matters now more than ever. Because the hidden words of Jeremiah, preserved by Baruch, aren't lost relics. They're a mirror reflecting the world we live in today, a world on the edge of repeating the same collapse, unless people wake up to the reality the official narrative has been trying to bury for centuries. And let me be clear, uncovering these hidden prophecies isn't just about academic curiosity or religious trivia. It's about survival, about recognizing the warning signs before it's too late. Because if history repeats, and it always does, then ignoring these messages guarantees the same outcome: collapse, chaos, and a world caught off guard when judgment finally comes. The fragments of Baruch's writings aren't myths. They're ancient, documented, studied by scholars, and feared by those who understand the power of truth when it's fully unleashed. And the deeper you explore them, the more undeniable the connections become to our history, our present, and our rapidly approaching future. So stay locked in, because we're not done yet. The next layer of this story pulls everything together. How these lost prophecies tie directly to the book of Revelation, to the final warnings for humanity, and to the undeniable signs playing out in real time across the globe. What comes next will shake your perspective, and once you hear it, there's no going back. You ever wonder how pieces of truth just vanish? I'm not talking about forgotten stories or misinterpreted words. I'm talking about deliberate erasure, about parts of history, warnings, messages so uncomfortable, so threatening to those in power, that they don't just get ignored, they get buried, destroyed. And what survives? Only what the system wants you to see. That's exactly what happened with the prophecies of Jeremiah. And the deeper you go, the more undeniable it becomes. Because scattered across ancient writings, hidden in forbidden archives, and tucked away in suppressed texts, are fragments, raw, terrifying fragments, that suggest parts of Jeremiah's message were wiped from the official record on purpose. And I'll tell you right now, they weren't removed because they were false. They were erased because they revealed too much. They exposed the corruption of leaders, the spiritual rot spreading through society, the inevitable consequences of rebellion against God, and most of all, they pointed to patterns so dangerous, so connected to global collapse, that allowing people to read them freely would have shattered the illusion of control. See, history is full of these moments when truth threatens power, and the powerful fight back, not with honest debate, but with silence. They rewrite the narrative, edit the record, burn the scrolls, discredit the voices that refuse to fall in line. And Jeremiah? He was public enemy number one for the religious and political leaders of his time. But here's the thing they underestimated. The truth has a nasty habit of surviving. And even after the walls of Jerusalem fell, after the temple burned, after entire generations were scattered in exile, pieces of Jeremiah's message kept resurfacing, not through the official channels, not in the polished religious texts handed down by empire-approved councils, but through fragments, copies hidden by underground communities, writings preserved in secrecy, whispers of prophecies that refused to die. We're talking about ancient manuscripts, parts of the book of Baruch, fragments linked to Jeremiah's original words, records scholars have spent decades dissecting. And what those fragments reveal is enough to make any honest person sit up and pay attention. These missing prophecies don't dance around the truth. They hit it head on. They describe nations crumbling from within, leaders manipulating faith for control, societies drowning in greed and arrogance, and most disturbingly, a cycle of collapse repeating itself across history, right up to our time. And that's the part they never wanted you to connect. Because the official story makes it easy to believe the fall of Jerusalem was a one-time event, an ancient tragedy disconnected from modern life. But the erased parts, the hidden warnings, they show it was never just about Jerusalem. It was about every nation, every empire, every generation that follows the same path of pride, corruption, and rebellion. And look around, it's happening again. You don't have to be a historian to see the parallels. Leaders exploiting fear for power, truth buried under propaganda, faith twisted into a business model, entire societies convincing themselves they're untouchable, right before everything collapses. But here's where it gets even darker. Some of those missing fragments describe not just general warnings, but specific, unsettling details about how deception spreads globally. They hint at a time when spiritual corruption isn't isolated to one nation. It infects the world. When leaders present themselves as saviors, while secretly steering people toward destruction. When the collapse isn't just political or military, it's moral, spiritual, all-encompassing. Sound familiar? It should, because we're living in the middle of that exact scenario. And those lost prophecies of Jeremiah, they saw it coming long before it arrived. But this isn't just about ancient texts collecting dust in forgotten libraries. It's about why they were hidden in the first place, and what they reveal about the people pulling the strings, both then and now. See, controlling information has always been the weapon of the powerful. Keep the message clean, manageable, easy to digest, and bury the rest. Especially the parts that expose corruption, predict collapse, or challenge the illusion that those in charge actually have everything under control. And when you realize that's exactly what happened with Jeremiah's most dangerous prophecies, it raises uncomfortable questions. How much of what we've been taught is filtered? How much truth was erased to protect the powerful? And most importantly, if fragments of those erased messages still exist, what happens when people finally hear them? Because make no mistake, those hidden words aren't just historical footnotes. They're warnings for right now. They describe a world teetering on the edge, repeating the same fatal mistakes, silencing truth while rushing headfirst into collapse. And the frightening part, most people are still asleep to it, distracted, entertained, fed a steady stream of narratives designed to pacify, to numb, to keep eyes closed while the foundations crack beneath our feet. But not everyone is asleep. Some are connecting the dots. Some are digging into the lost writings, the fragments that survived, the uncomfortable truths the system couldn't bury completely. And what they're finding? It aligns with the chaos we see today. The rise of deception, the moral decay, the global instability, the signs of judgment building on the horizon. It's all connected. The hidden prophecies of Jeremiah, the suppressed warnings of Baruch, the manipulation of spiritual truth for political control. It's the same story playing out again, just on a bigger, more dangerous stage. The question is, do you have the courage to face it? To look beyond the surface, beyond the sanitized version of history, and confront the reality of what those missing prophecies reveal? Because once you hear them, once you understand the full message they fought to erase, you'll never look at the world the same way again. Stay with me, because the next part of this story takes us straight to the heart of the battle. The connection between those lost prophecies and the most feared, most controversial book in the Bible, Revelation. And trust me, when you see how the pieces fit together, everything changes. Here's where things get real. We've talked about the missing fragments, the suppressed prophecies, the hidden messages from Jeremiah and Baruch. But have you stopped to ask why? Why would leaders, religious authorities, even entire systems of power go so far to erase parts of the message? What were they so afraid of? Let me tell you, it wasn't because those writings were false. It was because they were true, and they were dangerous. See, history has proven something over and over again. The most dangerous thing to any system of control isn't rebellion, it isn't weapons, it's truth. Unfiltered, raw truth. Truth that exposes corruption, strips the mask off of leaders, and reveals what's really happening behind the curtains of power. And Jeremiah? His entire ministry was built on ripping that curtain down. But there was one specific part of Jeremiah's message that made the rulers of his time lose sleep. His words didn't just talk about the fall of Jerusalem. They went further. They exposed how deep the corruption ran, how the leaders manipulated faith, twisted religion, and lied to the people to maintain control. And more importantly, those hidden prophecies suggested that this wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a repeating cycle, a pattern of spiritual and political collapse that every nation faces when it walks away from God. Think about that for a second. We're not just talking about ancient history or religious debate. We're talking about a prophetic blueprint for how the world operates. One so precise, so uncomfortable, that the people in power couldn't risk it being public knowledge. The book of Baruch and other hidden fragments didn't just echo Jeremiah's warnings, they expanded them. They called out the elites by name. They described systems of government and religion working hand in hand to keep people blind, obedient, and quiet. They predicted the consequences of a society that exalts pride, silences truth, and chooses leaders more interested in power than integrity. And here's the part most people miss. Those ancient leaders didn't destroy these writings because they were irrelevant. They buried them because they hit too close to home. Because those warnings didn't just apply to Jerusalem 2,600 years ago. They apply to every empire, every government, every religious institution that follows the same corrupt path. Look around today. You really think this is any different? You see it everywhere. Leaders crafting the narrative, controlling information, censoring voices that speak out. Systems that claim to represent the people but serve only their own agendas. Spiritual corruption disguised as progress. It's the same game, just dressed up for a modern audience. And the hidden prophecies of Jeremiah? They expose that game for exactly what it is. But here's what you have to understand. Suppression isn't random, it's strategic. Throughout history, when certain voices, certain books, certain messages disappear, it's never by accident. It's because someone with influence decided that truth was a threat. And that's exactly what happened with these lost prophecies. Imagine if the full extent of Jeremiah's message had been preserved openly. Imagine if generations grew up reading warnings not just about ancient destruction, but about how religious leaders manipulate faith, how empires crumble from internal rot, how deception spreads when people trade truth for convenience. That knowledge alone could have sparked reform, accountability, even revolution. But keeping those messages buried, that keeps people compliant, passive, distracted by rituals, blinded by promises of safety, lulled into believing the collapse could never happen to them. And that's the most dangerous illusion of all, thinking that what happened to Jerusalem can't happen again, that leaders today are somehow different, that societies can drift from truth, drown in corruption, and escape the same consequences Jeremiah warned about. But history doesn't work like that. Collapse isn't random. It's the result of repeated choices: pride, deception, spiritual decay. And Jeremiah's hidden prophecies laid that out with terrifying clarity. No wonder they were buried. But fragments survived, enough to show the pattern, enough to prove that what happened in ancient times isn't ancient at all. It's happening again, right in front of us. The manipulation of truth, the control of religion, the silencing of inconvenient voices, the arrogance of leaders convinced they're above consequence, the moral decay spreading through society, while people pretend everything's fine. And every time those signs appear, the same thing follows: collapse. It happened to Jerusalem. It happened to Babylon. It happened to Rome. And if you're paying attention, you can see the cracks forming again. But here's where this gets even more intense. Some of the suppressed fragments connected directly to visions of global deception, a world unified not in truth, but in lies. They described leaders claiming to offer peace, prosperity, even salvation, while secretly leading people into spiritual darkness. And those descriptions, they don't just sound familiar, they sound like headlines. You think global leaders working together, rewriting history, reshaping society, silencing dissent. That's new? Jeremiah saw it coming. Baruch documented it. And those in power? They tried to erase it before people connected the dots, but enough of the message survived. And now, those fragments are resurfacing. Scholars are uncovering ancient texts. Communities are revisiting forbidden writings. And piece by piece, the picture is becoming clear. This isn't conspiracy. This is history repeating itself. And the hidden prophecies prove it. So, ask yourself, why would entire sections of prophecy be buried? Who benefits when truth is controlled? And what happens when the parts of the message that survived finally reach the people they were always meant for? Because we're not talking about vague warnings or outdated sermons. We're talking about a roadmap for how collapse happens, how corruption spreads, and how societies fall asleep while the world burns. And make no mistake, once you understand that roadmap, you can't unsee it. You start noticing the patterns everywhere, in politics, in religion, in the global systems steering society. The pride, the deception, the same arrogance that led Jerusalem to its knees is alive and well today. But here's the question that matters most. Now that the hidden fragments are resurfacing, what are we going to do with them? Will we bury our heads like the people of Jeremiah's time? Or will we face the hard, uncomfortable, but necessary truth they fought to suppress? Because the next layer of this story connects those lost prophecies to the ultimate warning, the one written in the book of Revelation, the moment where global deception isn't just theory, it becomes reality. Stay with me, because what comes next will connect the ancient warnings, the missing fragments, and the terrifying events unfolding right now in ways most people aren't ready for. But once you hear it, there's no going back. Now listen closely, because this is where everything starts to come together, and honestly, this is where it starts to get uncomfortable. You've seen the fragments, you've heard the whispers about the lost prophecies, the censored warnings buried deep within the writings of Jeremiah and Baruch. But what if I told you those ancient hidden words don't just belong to the past? What if those messages weren't just history? They're prophecies still unfolding right now, in real time, and the connection leads straight to the most feared book in the entire Bible, Revelation. I know most people hear Revelation and immediately think of end-time predictions, chaos, destruction, the infamous four horsemen, the beast, global collapse. And let's be honest, that book has been misunderstood, twisted, and turned into entertainment for years. But buried beneath the surface of exaggerated interpretations is a brutal, unavoidable truth. Revelation describes a world that collapses the same way Jerusalem did, the same way every corrupt empire falls, and the hidden prophecies of Jeremiah. They match that pattern with terrifying precision. Here's what they never told you. The Bible is full of patterns. God speaks, people rebel, warnings are ignored, corruption spreads, collapse comes, and a remnant wakes up, if it's not too late. That pattern played out with Israel. It played out with Babylon. It played out with Rome, and Revelation makes it clear it plays out again on a global scale. So let's stop for a second and ask the question most people are too distracted to face. How do the hidden prophecies of Jeremiah connect to the chaos we're watching unfold today? And how does all of this lead straight to Revelation? Let me break it down, because once you see this, it's impossible to ignore. In the lost writings of Baruch and other suppressed texts tied to Jeremiah, there are disturbing, detailed descriptions of nations blinded by arrogance, spiritual leaders twisting truth for profit, political systems built on lies, and entire societies lulled into a false sense of security while the foundations rot beneath them. Sound familiar? It should. Because that's not just ancient history. That's the global system we're living in today. And Revelation? It picks up where those warnings left off, describing a world unified by deception, manipulated by spiritual and political elites, flooded with false promises of peace and prosperity, right before everything unravels. The hidden prophecies show the starting point, how corruption infects leadership, how spiritual decay gets disguised as progress, how empires convince themselves they're too powerful to fall. Revelation shows the end game, the total collapse of that system, global deception exposed, divine judgment unleashed. But here's where it gets even more intense. Both Jeremiah's suppressed prophecies and the book of Revelation describe something most people miss. That collapse never happens overnight. It starts slow. Small compromises, little lies, leaders replacing truth with control, people trading freedom for comfort. And before anyone realizes it, the entire foundation is weak, and all it takes is one crisis to bring it down. Look around. We're not just talking theory anymore. You can feel it. Global instability, economic systems cracking, nations on edge, morality collapsing, leaders manipulating truth. The same arrogance, the same rebellion Jeremiah warned about happening again. But this time, it's not isolated to one city or one nation. This time it's worldwide. And the missing prophecies? They warned of this exact moment. That societies that turn their backs on truth, that silence prophets, that erase inconvenient messages, don't avoid collapse, they guarantee it. Revelation describes the final stage of that collapse. Not just one nation falling, but a global system imploding under the weight of its own deception. The beast rising, false peace, global control disguised as unity, people willingly surrendering freedom for the illusion of safety. And Jeremiah's lost words? They laid the foundation for understanding how that system rises in the first place, through corruption, silence, manipulation, and the suppression of truth. But here's what should really wake you up. Revelation doesn't describe some distant future we can ignore. It describes signs, patterns, conditions that build over time. Signs we're watching unfold in front of us right now. Political division? Check. Global instability? Check. Leaders silencing dissent, manipulating faith, rewriting truth? Check. Societies drowning in arrogance, believing they're too advanced, too powerful to fall? It's happening. And yet, most people sleepwalk through it, distracted by entertainment, manipulated by media, kept docile by promises of convenience and security, exactly how the system wants it. But the lost prophecies of Jeremiah and Baruch, they were buried for this very reason. Because if people connected the dots, saw the repeating pattern, and understood how dangerously close we are to repeating history, the illusion would break. That's why this matters. That's why this message was erased, hidden, buried under centuries of religious and political control. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Revelation isn't random chaos. It's the final act of a story that's been playing out for thousands of years. And right now, we're living in the final chapters of that story. And if you think that's dramatic, open your eyes. Wars escalating, economies collapsing, morality inverted, leaders crafting narratives to keep people blind. It's all happening. The hidden prophecies warned us. Revelation confirms it. So, what does that mean for us? It means the warnings they tried to erase are resurfacing now for a reason. It means there's still time, barely, to wake up, to reject the lies, to call out the deception, to stop repeating the same fatal mistakes of history. But here's the brutal truth. Most won't listen. They didn't in Jeremiah's time. They didn't when Baruch preserved the message. They won't now, but some will. And those who do, they'll see the signs for what they are. They'll recognize the manipulation, the collapse, the rise of global deception described in both the lost prophecies and the pages of Revelation. The connection is undeniable. The system falling apart in front of us isn't random. It's prophecy playing out. And every buried word, every hidden message, every suppressed warning was designed to keep people distracted, asleep, complicit. But now the fragments are back. The truth is resurfacing. And those with eyes to see will understand. This isn't about ancient history. It's about the world we're standing in right now. Stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal next connects every suppressed warning to our current reality and shows exactly why this message was buried and why its return couldn't come at a more critical time. Let's cut through all the noise right now and face the uncomfortable reality nobody wants to talk about. When they erased the prophecies of Jeremiah, when they buried the words of Baruch, when they quietly edited out the warnings that connected ancient destruction to modern collapse, they weren't just hiding history. They were hiding a mirror that reflects exactly where we are today and exactly how close we are to making the same catastrophic mistakes. Let me tell you something most people can't handle. Truth never stays buried forever. You can burn scrolls, ban books, silence prophets, but eventually the truth resurfaces. And when it does, it always hits harder, because by the time it returns, the warnings have already started playing out. That's exactly where we are right now. We've walked through the fragments of Jeremiah's hidden message. We've looked at the suppressed writings of Baruch, the patterns of corruption, collapse, and deception that leaders from every generation have tried to erase. But now, the question we have to face is this: why were those messages removed in the first place? And what does their removal tell us about the moment we're living in? Here's the raw, unfiltered answer. They weren't erased because they were irrelevant. They weren't forgotten by accident. They were removed because they exposed the system. They revealed the blueprint of rebellion, of spiritual decay, of leadership corruption, of societies convincing themselves they're untouchable, right before they collapse. Think about that. If you were in power, religious, political, global power, and you had in your hands ancient writings that revealed how deception spreads, how truth gets twisted, how the people can be manipulated into complacency while everything crumbles behind the scenes, would you share that with the public? Or would you lock it away, destroy it, bury it so deep that only fragments survive? That's exactly what happened. The parts of Jeremiah's message that warned of systemic corruption, the parts that connected rebellion against God to the collapse of entire civilizations, the parts that hinted at a repeating global pattern of spiritual and moral decay leading to disaster, those were too dangerous to be left in plain sight. But here's where history always turns. Fragments survive, scholars dig, truth leaks through the cracks of control. And now, the very warnings they tried to erase are surfacing, at the exact moment when the world looks more like ancient Jerusalem than ever before. Let's stop sugarcoating this. We live in a time where the patterns are identical. Leaders manipulating truth, religion twisted for control, nations drowning in arrogance, societies chasing comfort, silencing anyone who speaks hard truth, just like they tried to silence Jeremiah. And the fragments? The hidden pieces of those lost prophecies? They aren't just history lessons. They're warnings written for moments exactly like this. Moments when the world convinces itself it's too advanced, too powerful, too modern to fall, while the same ancient patterns of pride, rebellion, and collapse play out right under our noses. But most people are still asleep to it, distracted by technology, entertainment, false promises of peace and prosperity, all while the foundations crack beneath their feet. That's why those prophecies were buried, because if the public saw the full picture, if they understood how dangerously close we are to repeating history, they might wake up. They might challenge the system. They might demand accountability. And the people in power? They can't afford that. So instead, they rewrite history. They edit scripture. They discredit anyone who dares to dig deeper. But like I said, truth has a way of surviving. And once you connect the dots, once you see how the hidden prophecies of Jeremiah align with the chaos of today, everything changes. Because what's happening now isn't random. It's the cycle playing out again. Pride before the fall, deception before collapse, silence before judgment. And the lost words of Jeremiah? They prove that when society reaches this point, when leaders lie, when faith becomes theater, when morality collapses, when truth is buried, judgment isn't a distant threat. It's inevitable. But here's the part that separates those who get it from those who stay blind. Understanding that history doesn't just repeat accidentally, it repeats because people ignore the warnings, because the hard truths make them uncomfortable, because they trade responsibility for convenience. And that's where we are right now. Most of the world is repeating the same rebellion that destroyed Jerusalem, that collapsed empires, that Revelation says will spread globally in the final days. But now, the buried prophecies are resurfacing. The mirror is being held up, and we've got a choice to make. Face it or keep running. And if you think running works, just look back at history. Every empire that silenced the prophets, every society that buried the truth, every nation that convinced itself it was immune to collapse, they all fell. Every single one. And the system today? It's no different. The deception just looks cleaner. The distractions are more advanced, but the pattern is identical. That's why they buried the message. Because it exposes the lie. It shatters the illusion. It reminds people that truth, real, raw, uncomfortable truth, always wins, even if it has to survive in fragments. And now, those fragments are back. The missing warnings, the parts of Jeremiah's prophecies they tried to erase, the suppressed writings of Baruch, the connections to Revelation. It's all resurfacing, and it's all pointing to the same unavoidable conclusion. History is repeating, and the window to change course is closing. But here's the thing. The people who silenced Jeremiah couldn't stop the fall of Jerusalem. The leaders who buried Baruch's writings couldn't prevent the collapse. And the global system trying to silence the truth today, they won't stop what's coming either. So the real question isn't whether the collapse is coming. It's whether you're awake to see it, whether you recognize the signs, whether you understand the mirror being held up through these lost, buried prophecies. Because once you see it, once you connect the dots, you can't unsee it. The question is, what will you do with that truth? Stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal next brings this all full circle. We're going to dig into how these ancient hidden prophecies don't just expose the collapse, they reveal the only way out. And trust me, once you hear it, you'll understand exactly why they fought so hard to bury this message in the first place. So now we've reached the part no one likes to face. The final, unavoidable question that's been hanging over everything we've uncovered so far. We've exposed the hidden prophecies of Jeremiah, the suppressed writings of Baruch, the buried warnings that connected ancient rebellion to modern collapse. We've peeled back the layers of deception, control, and silence that powerful systems used for centuries to keep people blind to the truth. But after all that, there's one brutal question left on the table. What does it all mean for us? Right now, today. What happens next? And maybe the hardest truth of all. Why were those messages removed, hidden, buried? And what do they mean for the time we're standing in? I'm going to say this as clearly as possible. No fluff, no religious sugarcoating. The reason those prophecies were erased wasn't because they were irrelevant to us. It's the opposite. They were too relevant, too specific, too exposing. They didn't just describe the collapse of Jerusalem. They outlined how every generation, every empire, every so-called powerful system falls when it follows the same broken path. And that broken path? We're on it. But here's where this hits even harder. Buried inside the fragments, hidden within the warnings they tried to erase, there's more than just exposure of corruption and collapse. There's a glimpse of something else. A key that separates those who repeat history from those who survive it. You see, Jeremiah's message was never just destruction for the sake of destruction. It was a final wake-up call, a hard, brutal, unavoidable reality check designed to break pride, expose deception, and force people to choose. Stay blind, stay comfortable, stay controlled, or wake up, face the truth. and change course before it's too late. That's what they tried to bury. That's what they wanted gone. Because if people realize that collapse isn't random, that rebellion follows patterns, that deception can be exposed, then suddenly, the system of control weakens. Suddenly, people stop believing the lie that they're powerless. Suddenly, the cycle can be broken. But let me be straight with you. Breaking that cycle isn't easy. It requires more than just knowing the truth. It takes courage to face it. Courage to admit we've been distracted, manipulated, pacified by comfort and convenience while the world burns around us. And most people, they won't do it. That's why the warnings were buried, because they separate the few who are willing to wake up from the masses who will sleepwalk straight into the next collapse. But you're still here. You've listened this far, which means you see the cracks in the system. You feel the patterns repeating. You know deep down, this isn't random. You know the ancient warnings hidden for centuries were buried for a reason, and that reason is playing out in real time right now on a global scale. It means the question isn't about ancient history anymore. It's about you, about us, about whether we keep ignoring the mirror being held up by these lost prophecies, or whether we finally face it. Because here's the raw, final truth most won't tell you. Collapse can't be avoided when pride, rebellion, and deception are allowed to grow unchecked. History proves it. Scripture confirms it. The lost words of Jeremiah and Baruch scream it. But there's always a remnant. Always those who refuse to stay blind. Those who refuse to let buried truth stay buried. Those who see the warnings for what they are, not just distant prophecies, but road signs flashing red as we speed toward the same fate. So what does all this mean for us? It means the time for comfort is over. The time for easy answers, religious games, political distractions. It's done. The truth is out. The fragments have resurfaced. The patterns are undeniable. The collapse isn't coming. It's already begun. But those with eyes to see, those willing to confront the full, uncomfortable hidden message, they still have a choice. Stay asleep or wake up. Stay blind or face reality. Follow the system or follow the truth, even when it costs everything. And here's the reality. Truth always costs something, but ignoring it costs more. So ask yourself, right now, do you really think it's coincidence that these suppressed prophecies are resurfacing now? That the patterns Jeremiah warned about, the signs Revelation describes, the collapse of empires, the rise of global deception, are all converging in our lifetime? There are no coincidences, only warnings and choices. You've heard the truth, you've seen the pieces. Now the choice is yours, but don't let this message die here. Don't let the buried prophecies stay